They did not rule the world with armies. They ruled it with ships, secrets, and salt water. In 1500, a city floating on mud and tides controlled more wealth than most empires. This is how Venice turned a lagoon into global power. Venice began not as a planned city, but as a reaction to collapse. In the 5th and 6th centuries, as the Western Roman Empire disintegrated under waves of Germanic and later Lombard invasions, people from the Roman towns of northern Italy fled toward the Adriatic coast. They crossed shallow waters and mudflats into a scattered chain of islands inside a tidal lagoon, a place no army wanted and no ruler could easily claim. These islands, later known as the Venetian Lagoon, were unstably flooded twice daily by the tides, thick with mosquitoes, and unsuitable for agriculture. Yet they offered one advantage no mainland city had: safety. Early settlers built wooden platforms driven deep into the mud, laying the foundations for what would become Venice. They lived from fishing, salt production, and small-scale trade, connected more by boats than by roads. The lagoon created a natural moat that made conquest difficult and communication with the outside world selective. This isolation shaped a distinct mentality. Venetians learned to rely on ships, contracts, and cooperation rather than land, armies, or feudal lords. With no fertile hinterland to fight over, power came from commerce and navigation. From these fragile beginnings emerged a society that would turn uncertainty into one of the most resilient and commercially focused states in European history. By the early Middle Ages, Venice had transformed its geographic disadvantage into a strategic system built on the sea, with no fields to harvest and no land routes to control. Survival depended entirely on ships. This necessity produced one of the most sophisticated maritime infrastructures in the pre-industrial world. At its center stood the Venetian arsenal, founded in 1104, a state-owned shipyard that became the largest industrial complex in Europe. By the 15th century, it employed thousands of skilled workers and could assemble a fully equipped galley in a matter of days. The arsenal was organized with standardized parts, specialized labor, and continuous production lines. Centuries before, similar methods appeared in modern factories: timber from the forests of the Veneto, rope from Dalmatia, iron from Alpine mines, and sails from Venice's own workshops all flowed into a coordinated system designed to keep fleets at sea. Venice did not just build ships, it built a logistical machine. Convoys, known as mood, sailed on fixed schedules between Venice and major ports in the eastern Mediterranean, carrying merchants and state-regulated cargo. Naval power, trade, and bureaucracy became inseparable. This integration allowed Venice to protect its roots, enforce contracts, and dominate maritime commerce without maintaining large territorial armies, creating a state designed for movement rather than land control. By the 15th century, Venice had positioned itself at the most valuable intersection of the medieval world. Goods from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East flowed into European markets through a narrow chain of ports that ended in the Venetian Lagoon. Spices such as pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg arrived from India and Southeast Asia through Arab and Persian merchants, passed through Alexandria or Constantinople, and were then shipped by Venetian fleets to northern Europe. Silk from China, cotton from Egypt, and precious stones from the Indian Ocean followed the same routes. Venetian merchants did not produce these goods. They controlled the system that moved them. Through treaties with the Byzantine Empire and later with the Ottoman sultans, Venice secured privileged access to key ports, warehouses, and customs exemptions. This allowed Venetian traders to buy bulk cargoes at favorable rates and sell them at enormous markups in markets from London to Bruges. By 1500, Venice handled a large share of Europe's luxury imports, making its currency, the gold ducat, one of the most trusted in international trade. Wealth concentrated in the hands of merchant families who reinvested profits into ships, insurance, and new voyages, creating a self-reinforcing commercial network that turned geography into economic dominance. Unlike most European powers of the late Middle Ages, Venice did not develop around a royal dynasty. From the 9th century onward, It evolved into a republic governed by its leading merchant families. At the top stood the Doge, elected for life, but his authority was tightly limited by a web of councils designed to prevent any individual from gaining absolute power. Real control rested with institutions such as the Great Council and the Senate, bodies dominated by families whose wealth came from maritime trade rather than land ownership. This system was deliberately constructed to protect stability. After internal conflicts in the 13th century, Venice closed political membership to a fixed group of patrician families in an event known as the Serrata of 1297. This transformed the republic into a hereditary oligarchy, but it also ended the violent power struggles that plagued other Italian cities. Political continuity became as valuable as profit, because the ruling elite depended on commerce. State policy focused on protecting shipping routes, enforcing contracts, and maintaining diplomatic relations that kept trade flowing. Venice avoided territorial wars when possible and invested instead in fleets and treaties. The government operated less like a monarchy and more like a corporate board, managing risk assets and long-term commercial strategy across the Mediterranean. Venice understood that information could be more powerful than force. By the 15th century, the Republic had built one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in Europe. Its ambassadors, merchants, and ship captains were expected to report not only on trade, but on political developments, military movements, and economic conditions in every port they visited. These reports were collected by the Council of Ten, a powerful security body that oversaw state secrecy, counterintelligence, and political surveillance. Venetian agents operated across the courts of Europe and within the Ottoman Empire, often posing as traders or diplomats. They gathered data on grain supplies, fleet construction, and diplomatic alliances, allowing Venice to anticipate crises before they became wars. When conflict threatened, the Republic frequently used subsidies and bribes to influence rivals, or secure neutrality, a cheaper and more reliable strategy than prolonged military campaigns. Economic warfare was equally important. Venice could raise or lower customs duties, delay shipments, or redirect trade to punish hostile states. Because so many European markets depended on Venetian shipping, these measures had immediate effects. The Republic's ability to manipulate commerce and intelligence meant that many of its victories were never marked by battles, only by shifting contracts, altered alliances, and competitors quietly forced out of the marketplace. By the late 15th century, Venice faced its most powerful rival in the Ottoman Empire. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean coastline and the major trade routes that connected Europe to Asia. This placed Venice in a paradoxical position. The Republic was a Christian state, yet its prosperity depended on access to Muslim-controlled ports rather than pursue endless war. Venice chose negotiation and payment. Treaties with Ottoman sultans, such as Mehmed II and Bayezid II, granted Venetian merchants trading privileges in cities like Alexandria, Aleppo, and Constantinople in exchange for tribute and customs fees. These agreements allowed Venetian convoys to operate under Ottoman protection, keeping spices, silk, and grain flowing into Europe. Conflicts did occur, especially over islands and ports, such as Cyprus and Crete. But even during wars, trade often continued through neutral intermediaries. Venice understood that cutting off commerce would damage both sides. This pragmatic relationship allowed the Republic to survive between two worlds, balancing religious identity with economic necessity. By prioritizing trade over ideology, Venice maintained its position as the main commercial bridge between East and West well into the 16th century, even as empires rose and fell around it. The flow of goods through Venice did more than enrich its merchant families. It reshaped the cultural and economic landscape of Europe. Profits from spice and silk trade financed banks, shipping insurance, and credit systems that spread far beyond the Lagoon. Venetian financiers provided capital for merchants in Florence, Antwerp, and London, helping to integrate European markets into a single commercial network. This wealth also fueled the Renaissance. Venetian printing houses produced books in unprecedented numbers, spreading scientific and philosophical ideas across the continent. Artists such as Giovanni Bellini, and Tintoretto were supported by patrons whose fortunes came directly from maritime trade. Scientific instruments, pigments, and luxury materials reached European workshops through Venetian ports. Venice also funded exploration indirectly. As competition for Asian goods increased, European states sought new sea routes to bypass the Venetian Ottoman system. The Portuguese voyages around Africa and the Spanish expeditions across the Atlantic were motivated in part by the desire to break Venice's hold on Eastern trade. In this way, the city helped trigger the shift from a Mediterranean-centered world to a global one. Venice did not discover the New World, but the wealth it generated made the age of exploration economically possible. By the early 16th century, the foundations of Venice's power began to erode. In 1498, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around the Cape of Good Hope, opening a direct sea route between Europe and Asia. This breakthrough allowed spices to be shipped straight to Atlantic ports, by passing the Ottoman-controlled Middle East, and, with it, Venetian shipping networks. Prices fell, and the monopoly that had made Venice wealthy for centuries was broken. At the same time, Venice faced growing military and political pressure in Europe. In 1508, a coalition known as the League of Cambrai, formed by France, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and the papacy, launched a coordinated attack on Venetian territories in northern Italy. Although Venice survived, it lost key lands and was forced to shift resources from trade to defense. These changes marked a structural shift in global commerce. The center of economic gravity moved from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Venice remained rich and independent, but it was no longer essential. A city built to dominate medieval trade routes found itself sidelined by oceanic empires, new technologies, and the expanding geography of the modern world. The lagoon still held ships, but the world had moved beyond it. After 1600, Venice no longer shaped the direction of global trade, but it did not disappear. The Republic adapted by becoming a regional power, focusing on Adriatic commerce, manufacturing, and diplomacy. Its political institutions remained stable even as its economic influence declined. While Atlantic empires accumulated colonies and resources across the globe, Venice preserved its independence through careful neutrality and negotiation. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte entered the city in 1797, ending more than 1,000 years of Republican government, Venice had already become a symbol of an earlier world. Its grand palaces, canals, and shipyards reflected a time when wealth was earned, not through empires of land, but through mastery of movement, finance, and information. Today, Venice survives as a living record of how a city built on water once controlled the flow of goods between continents. Its history shows that power does not always come from size or armies. For centuries, it came from understanding how to move things, how to connect markets, and how to make geography work in your favor. That legacy still defines the city long after its empire has faded.